Hi, thanks for joining another video in our Watercolor for Real Beginners series. I'm Michelle Crawford, and today we're going to be talking all about how to activate your watercolor paints. We'll discuss water control, how much water to use, and we'll also be utilizing just 2 brushes and a variety of brush strokes to learn how to apply our paint to paper. If you haven't been following along, don't forget to check out the rest of the videos and hit that subscribe button so you can stay tuned for the next one. So far, we've talked about watercolor supplies, which things you really need to have and what are nice to have. We also learned how to swatch our paint palette. And in the last couple videos, we learned how to mix both very vibrant as well as very muted colors using just our split primary palette. So if you want to learn those things, check out the other videos in this series. But again, today we're going to be talking all about how to use our supplies, how to create these brush strokes and a variety of marks on our paper utilizing just 2 brushes. And we're also going to be learning a lot of information about how to activate our paints, how to use water, when is it too much, when's not enough. After today, you'll be able to really be very confident and learn about ways to practice watercolor in an effort to move forward on your watercolor journey. So with that, let's get started by going through our supplies. In a lot of the other videos, I've provided a downloadable PDF for free as a project reference. For today, we really don't have a reference. We don't need one. So you can just grab your least expensive watercolor paper. We're going to be doing some practice exercises today. So this is all about learning how to utilize our supplies, how to make specifically different marks using brush strokes on our paper. And so this is a practice. We don't want to use our best watercolor paper. So as I've been using throughout the series, I've got my B watercolor paper here. You can also use a sketchbook or something like that. But that's the first thing here. I also have my Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor palette here. Again, we unboxed this in one of the earlier videos in the series. And so far, aside from just swatching the paints, we've only used our split primaries, which are our warm and cool blues, warm and cool red, and warm and cool yellow. And this will be able to use whichever colors you like. So feel free to mix colors and try out some of the color mixing techniques that you learned in the last couple of videos, or you can start to dive into some of the neutrals and greens that we have on the other side of our palette. And of course, you don't have to have this exact paint palette. I like Winsor & Newton Cotman because it's their intermediate brand. It's very inexpensive as far as watercolor paints go, but it also has a really high quality. And I think it's really great for beginners. And you don't need a lot of colors. We just learned in the last 2 videos that, with just the split primary, you're able to make a lot of other hues. And so far, that's all you really need, but use whatever you have. I also have a towel here. I like to keep this handy to kind of dab off my brush if it's, too wet, or also sometimes I keep paper towels handy. I do have some to my left here, but you can also use this to dab as well. And that's just if you want to, remove some paint from your watercolor paper. I have a spray bottle here. This is a really nice to have item. We'll use this to help us activate our paints. And of course, I also have a jar of water here for rinsing off my dirty brush, and then clean water here so that I can dip my brush here. And I've just got 2 brushes with me today. So don't have to get too specific here, other than you need a round brush and a flat wash brush. So I've got a size 6 round brush, and this is a 3/4 inch wash brush. And that's only because that was the smallest one that I had. We're going to be using just these 2 brushes. And again, a variety of brush strokes to make different marks and learn how to build confidence with how we're applying our paint to the paper, how much paint to use when we're loading our brush, how much water to use. And this is really going to help out any new beginner learn how to use your supplies. So if you've got a 1-inch wash brush, if you have a 1/2 inch wash brush, that's fine. Honestly, if you have maybe like a 1/2 inch, that would be a really good size for this exercise. And again, I'm using a size 6 round. You could have an 8, a 10, whatever you have handy. I like the size 6 because it's not too big, it's not too small. We're going to be able to see a variety of the marks you can make with a round brush with just a size 6. So, but whichever you have, you just need one round brush and one flat wash brush. All right. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. So first I'm going to take out one of my sheets of paper here. We've got a full-size sheet, or almost like an 8.5 by 11 or letter size sheet like I do here. We'll probably use 2 of these. And so we might need a couple sheets, or if you're using a sketchbook, we might be using up a few pages. But again, this is just a practice exercise. This is something that you can do over and over again to, practice your watercolor. So don't be too hard on yourself. This is just a learning exercise. All right, so to get started, I think we're going to learn about a few mistakes that most new beginners make when they're starting to put paint to paper. And so we'll kind of show you what a couple of those mistakes look like. But what I'll point out is our watercolor pan set. These are dried watercolor paints in a pan. And so we haven't used, these neutrals yet, and they're still very, very solid, very dry. And we're going to need to use water to activate them. Water's not just, an ingredient to like make the paint painty out of the solid form, but the amount of water we use is actually going to help us determine different color values and things with our paints. And so we're going to learn all about water control today as well. How much water do you need? It kind of depends on what color you're trying to produce. And also, some basic rules about how much is too much water on your brush, things like that we'll address in the video. So to get started, I'm just going to spray down my colors. And for this, you can use any colors you want. If you've got a real pretty color on your palette you haven't used yet, feel free to use that. I might use this Viridian and my sap green because, we haven't really delved into those yet. But whichever color you think is prettiest, pick that one, and we can switch up as we go. Again, it's just an exercise, but first step in activating your paints is get them very wet. You can do this if you don't have a spray bottle. You can, load up your brush with water and drip it on there. I've seen people use like little eyedroppers, but again, I think it's very handy to have a spray bottle. Now that we've wet down our watercolor paints, I'm going to take my watercolor brush, which right now is still dry, and I'm just going to pick a color. Let's choose my blue over here. And I'm going to go ahead and mark my paper. But that's not exactly what I expected. The color's very dark in some areas, light in others. It's not moving. This is what we call a dry brush. And if you wanted to have this technique, this is how you do it. But this essentially, if you're seeing this and the texture's coming through the paper, your brush, you don't have enough water. So maybe we need water on our brush. So, okay, let's start with that. Some of these colors aren't super wet yet. I'm going to go ahead and, add some water to my brush. Now let me go into a new color, pick up some paint, and I'm still struggling though I have maybe a little bit more pigment and more paint on my brush. I'm still not getting a very good result as far as having a nice even mark across my paper. Again, we don't have enough water. Very key ingredient to watercolor is water. So it's going to be helpful if you have a palette handy. You don't necessarily need to have one, but it's going to help us create different values for our washes and learn more about water control. If you don't have a palette, you can grab a dish, a plate, something that's white, or maybe your watercolor set here. And I've just removed mine to make it easier to use here in my studio. But if you have a lid on your watercolors, there will be a palette inside. So what do we do wrong? We wet our paints. Then a dry brush is going to create a dry brush result on our paper. So we also need to wet our brush. Some brushes are made out of synthetic materials. Some of them are more natural material. Different materials hold different amounts of water. But if you don't wet your brush, we're not going to have enough water to go ahead and activate our paints. So also, before we're going to go right into the paint, into the paper. No, let's use our Viridian as an example. So this paint was dry. I've added some water to it. Now I've got water on my brush, and I am going to gently, with the tip of my brush, kind of stir the paint until it starts to become more of a paint-like consistency. Now, if you wanted a really saturated version of this color on your paper, you could take that and go right to paper. You can see I'm getting a much more even mark here and a very saturated or very highly pigmented version of this color. What if I wanted it to be lighter? Typically, to lighten a color in watercolor, you're going to add water. You can do that by spraying more water on your palette, but as you're continuing to activate, you're going to add more pigment to your wash. So that's why it's great to have a palette. So again, I'm going to wet my paint, wet my brush. We're going to activate it. And instead of going straight to my paper, I'm going to take that over to my palette. And you see I've got a lot of pigment there I've picked up. And going from the paint at this point, it's a little bit creamy on the very top of the surface of the paint. But what's underneath is starting to be kind of tacky. That's how you know the pan is, not so wet, but we're going to get a highly pigmented swoop of this color. Okay. Now, in order to change the value of this, we're going to add water. You can either just kind of spray some additional water into your palette, and then you're going to want to mix that in with our wash, is what we're calling this. So when you take paint from your pan and put it on your palette and add water, we're creating a wash. Especially when you're painting large backgrounds or large objects in your watercolor, can be very convenient to mix up a large amount of paint. And so this is how you can do that and create washes with different values. So again, I'm going to add a little bit more water. So that time I just went to my dirty side of my water jar. Typically, if you're switching colors, you'll want to rinse off the dirty side and then grab clean water for your mix so you don't introduce any other colors. But as I'm adding water, you're seeing it's getting creamier and creamier, but it's also getting less saturated. So when I go to paper now, we're still seeing that same color, but it's a less saturated version. With watercolor, even though we have a white in our palette, which you can use to kind of mix some more opaque pastel colors, but for the most part, we use the white of the paper. Watercolor is translucent, meaning you can kind of see through it, and the less pigment and more water we add to our mix, the lighter the color is going to be. So to test that theory, we've got this nice wash here. You could, continue using that, but maybe I wanted an even lighter version of this color. I could take some of this wash and put it in my next pan here, and then we'll add more water. What do we think will happen? It's a slightly lighter color. Let's add a little bit more water. And how much water is too much? Well, on your brush, you always want to load up your brush with the consistency of paint you want on your paper. So as I'm loading up my brush, here I activated my paint. I did load a lot of paint into the brush, but it's still not evenly saturated. When you make a wash, when you add water to that wash and your brush is nice, evenly wet, you're stirring this together and making a nice, evenly mixed wash. After I'm done applying this to my paper, I think another mistake people make is, okay, I'm going to go back and get more water. And if you were going to your paint again, that would be ideal. But if you already have your wash mixed up, just go back into your wash. We want to saturate our brush, especially if you're trying to fill a space with the same color. You want to saturate your brush with paint, not with more water. Anytime you add water, say we went into our paint palette this time, then we went in. Now we're going to be adding clean water into the mix, and our colors can be getting lighter. We might even, since it's not evenly mixed, start to see blooms and things show up. And what happens if we I just want to make a slightly lighter version of this color. If I go in with just water, you're definitely going to see now some blooms and things forming. So again, just go right back into your wash, make sure it's nice and mixed up. If it starts to dry on you, you can always, resaturate watercolor, even if it dries completely. Just add more water until you have the same value wash. And that's how you should be activating and mixing up your watercolor paint, whether you're doing it from our pan or from a palette. All right, so now that we know how to get our paint from our pan into our palette and onto paper, let's talk about different marks we can make with a variety of brushes. For the rest of this exercise, we're going to be using just the two brushes, your round brush and the wash brush. And we will, kind of do some exercises for both. But again, these are really great practice exercises for you. So after you complete this project, this is something that you can do, in your sketchbook or during your practice time to get better at controlling your brush, your paint, and your water. All right, so with a round brush, no matter what size it is, typically they're going to come to a nice tip. What's great about round brushes and why we love them for watercolor is the versatility. With this brush, you can make not just a very fine, thin line, but you can also make, depending on the size of your watercolor brush, how big around it is, you can make even bigger, broader strokes. So we're going to learn how to do that right now. So if you want to continue using the same color you have been, feel free. I'm going to mix it up a little bit though, and I'm going to use my blue here. So again, we're going to be doing a variety of brush strokes with this, and so I want to mix up a wash. And so I'm activating my blue paint here, which is my cerulean blue. And you see I've got a puddle in there. That's how you know that you're starting to activate, and that puddle will start to turn a little bit more thick into watercolor paint. All right, let's put that paint here on our palette. And right now my brush is very much also loaded with this paint, so don't waste the paint that's on your brush quite yet. So we're going to add some water to that and then use that brush to mix up your wash. All right, so if you have too much paint or water on your brush, you'll see it's going to drip. That's too much. You can see it's going to drip on my paper. If I try to go make a mark with this, it's going to be very inconsistent. And so what you want to have is a very wet but non-dripping brush. What I tend to do is just kind of, after loading my brush with the wash, I'm just going to tap it on the side there, and now it's not dripping and we can do our brush strokes. And you should also see that your brush, once you load it, is going to have a nice pointed tip. So if you hold your brush upright, you'll have the most control. And what we're going to practice here is just using the tip of our brush and a very light pressure to create a thin horizontal line. This might be a little bit more difficult at first. You gotta, really have a delicate touch here, but with any size round brush, you're able to get these very thin lines. If you're starting to skip or your color's starting to change hue, or if your color's starting to be, less saturated, go back into your wash here, again, tapping it on the side. And this is a great practice. Holding your brush vertical gives you the most control here, because we're not going to be using the side of the brush. You want to have just the tip of your brush touching the paper and putting down the paint. And of course, you can do this in any direction. So you can do it vertically. Just practice making those marks. So it's great to have a brush that can do that, but what else can this brush do? Well, I'm going to go back in my blue here. This time, I'm going to hold my brush horizontal to the stroke that I'm going to make, but it's going to be at an angle, about a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to use a little bit more pressure when I apply the brush to my paper. So when I'm making this mark, I'm using the whole belly of the brush to make a nice, thick, even mark on my paper. Again, you can do this horizontally, vertically. Once you start to see that dryness, get more paint. And again, just kind of seeing with different amounts of pressure, you can get different size widths in your lines. Again, light pressure, you're going to have a very fine line. The most pressure, you're going to get a thicker line, but there's lots of widths in between. So this is a great practice to learn about not just how to hold the brush to get these, but also how to use pressure to get different marks as well. So that's great. We can do a very thin line and this nice broad line, but we can do even more with this brush. Let's go back into our wash. Depending on the way that you hold the brush, before we were just laying the brush the same direction as the line or mark we were trying to make. What if I were to hold it upright and make a horizontal line and still use enough pressure to use all that paint in the belly of the brush? I can actually get a very wide line. This does use up a lot of paint when you use the entire brush. So with a smaller, it's kind of more of a medium-sized brush, this number 6, where you might need to load up a little bit more often. But you can see we can get some really broad, even broader strokes with just our round brush. So again, super versatile. We can make lines. They can be thin, wide. They can go up and down or left and right. But what else can we do with this brush? Well, learning how to use pressure isn't just about making different size lines, but we can also use it to create variety in our line work. For this, let's go ahead and mix up another color. I'm going to rinse off my brush in my dirty water to get all that glue off because I don't want to contaminate the next color I'm going to mix, which will be my pink. This is Permanent Rose in my palette. If you have Opera Rose or any type of pink, but again, whichever color you like best, use that one. All right, so you can see I've activated my paint. Now I've got this nice thick wash here in my palette. I want to add water to that. It'll be easier to do it with the spray bottle so we don't want to contaminate our clean rinse water. Just now that I've got my mix loaded up my brush, I'm going to tap it on the side. Now we're going to start as if we were doing our thin lines, but then we're going to utilize variations in pressure to make our line thick or thin, thick or thin. And this type of a pressure stroke is going to be really, really useful in watercolor. And it's why we love our round brushes so much. I'm going to start out with light pressure, very thin line, and then heavy pressure. You can see my brush was not quite wet enough, so go back in there, light pressure, heavy, and then we're going to come back to a light pressure. And so as you're using pressure and pushing down to use the belly of the brush, you're actually able to make broader strokes. And as you pull it up, as you're making a stroke, stroke is going to get even thinner. Let's add even more water here to our mix. And you can try a variety of different lines. That one we did, 3 large bumps, but as you get better at this, you'll learn how to control, so you can use, very small bumps. This is also a great technique that you'll use for painting leaves. You can see I'm still getting a lot of dry brush on my paper. That's because I'm not using the best watercolor paper with this exercise. And it's not about the quality of this piece of art when we're done. It's about learning how to make these mechanical moves with your brush. If this is happening to you, however, it could be that your brush is just not holding enough water. And so I have a number 6 that I've been using, but I'm going to now switch to a larger brush, not too much larger, but let's go with a number 8. This will hold a little bit more water and I should be able to make longer marks with this brush. Okay, go back in here, load up our brush. Since I have a fresh brush, I want to make sure I do the same act of loading. Okay, let's do this again. Pressure, light, pressure, light. And try short ones, try long ones. Practice pulling it up and making really thin marks. And so this is a great way to practice making different pressure strokes. Another stroke that we'll use a lot in watercolor is a C curve. And we use this a lot with florals, with leaves. And there's a couple different ways to do these. The first one, same idea with our line here is you can, say we're going to make the shape of a C. We're going to start with very light pressure. As we're going around our C, we're going to put more pressure down on our brush. And as we come back around, we're going to pick up. And so you almost get this like half moon shape. And this is a great exercise for brush control. Again, tip of your brush, pressure, try to get to the tip so it looks more like a half moon. Another version of this, just go around the right side. So practice both sides. Coming up. Pressure. And as I'm coming around, I'm lifting up the brush. So it's just the tip touching the paper. This is also really helpful for flower petals. And so if you were to start with heavy pressure and as you're coming around, you release the pressure, you can do more of like a flower petal shape. So we'll do heavy. And when we come around, we'll release. And do that both ways. Light and then heavy. Heavy. Light. And go up. Heavy. Light. You can see we're just getting some more organic shapes that might start to resemble some petals. And I encourage you to just start trying out different things that you can do with the brush. One of the, being able to combine some of these is, maybe similar to calligraphy, you can practice, a thin stroke on the way up and a heavy stroke on the way down. Thin stroke up, heavy on the way down, and do a line of those. You can also do the reverse of that, where you do a heavy stroke on the way up and a thin stroke on the way down. Heavy, thin. And so very similar to calligraphy, we're utilizing pressure and also the kind of angle of the brush to make these different marks. And this is also a great brush for doing compound strokes that we would use with leaves. So for a compound stroke, we want to, just as we're making a thin line, we're moving across the page, we want to do that, but apply pressure on just one side of the line. This is how we'll make something like a leaf. So if you start with the tip of your brush, apply heavy pressure, we're not curving the line, we're trying to make it straight as possible, and then let go. We're getting kind of half of a leaf there. And then we do it again on the other side. And you can see we formed kind of a leaf shape. I'm running out of room here on my paper. If you want to grab another sheet and keep practicing with your round brush, go ahead and pause the video and practice as much as you would like. But on the next sheet, we're going to talk about how do we make a variety of marks, not just with our round brush, but also with our flat wash brush. But you may think, oh, what are we going to do with a wash brush? Well, typically we use them to lay a wash, but there's actually a variety of different brush strokes that you can use with this brush as well to make, again, some very interesting marks. And so take a moment, pause, practice these strokes, and come back right here, and we're going to move on to our wash brush. Now that you've finished practicing with your round brush, let's grab a new sheet of paper and start learning about the different brush strokes and marks we can make with our wash brush. So once again, pick a color of your choice. You could go ahead and either activate and make a wash, or you could even just reuse some of the colors on your palette here if they have dried a little bit. All you need to do is add some water. Make sure you mix these up really good before you use them with a wash brush. Sometimes it is kind of hard to get the brush into your paint here if you've got a half pan set. So it is nice to be able to mix up a wash ahead of time for our larger wash brush. So I'm just going to keep using my Viridian green here, and I am actually going to grab my round brush just to activate my paints and pull that paint onto the palette. Again, just kind of using my brush, just move all that water around and pull pigment right out. And then, of course, we'll add some clean water to turn this into a wash. So you might, of course, think we're using a wash brush. Isn't that just for making large washes? And yes, it's nice to have for that, but there are a lot of other ways that you can use this. So let's go ahead and load up our wash brush here. And just like our round brush, there's some versatility here with our large wash brush. So if you hold it vertically and you've got your bristles going horizontally across your paper, just like our round brush, you can use a light touch and a steady hand to make a thin line. Go ahead and practice making some thin lines. If you rotate your brush 90 degrees, you can do that up and down as well. So this is a good practice to get used to utilizing this brush. Alternatively, if you rotate your brush, keep your brush in that same orientation, but use a horizontal stroke, you're going to get a very wide stroke. So similar to the round brush, however, quite a big difference now in the size of our stroke here. And you can see that this brush holds lots of paint and lots of water. You can do that vertically as well. And of course, any angle you hold this in between a 90 degree, you're going to get a variation in the width of your line. So if I hold it about a 45, you can see this line is about half the width of the large one. I can go even smaller than that, and you'll see that I'm also getting a different kind of edge as we're starting and ending with the brush at an angle. You can do that vertically as well. And just try holding it at different angles and seeing what kind of horizontal and vertical strokes you can get. Just like we had a pressure stroke with our round brush, we can actually, we're not technically using pressure, we're kind of rotating our brush, but we can change the way that we rotate the brush as we're making a brush stroke as well to get a similar effect as we would with the pressure stroke in water or with our round brush. So let's give this a try. I'm going to start with my brush in a horizontal line, and I'm just going to change the rotation of my brush while I'm pulling it across the page. And you can see, very similar to our round brush, we're able to get some varying widths in our line. And that time I kind of just rotated the top of the brush. Now let's see if I can just kind of rotate the bottom of the brush. And you can see, try out different patterns and different ways of holding the brush, and you can make these short or long. And similar to the round brush, but kind of a different shape that we're getting here. So there's two different ways that you can do that. And of course, you can do that horizontally and vertically as well. And just like with our round brush, we had some C curves. And so if you hold your brush with the bristles horizontal and you do a C curve, you'll notice we're getting a very similar C curve that we did with our round brush, but it's able to get a lot wider, and we're getting kind of more of a lined up end. And actually, if you put two of these together, you kind of see some hand lettering strokes appearing here. So think of the brush also similar to the shape of a calligraphy pen. And so, for example, I can rotate the brush, the bristles going vertically, and do the same thing. And I'm not using pressure, I'm just using the angle of the brush to create these different strokes. Very similar to calligraphy, but could be also really useful with our watercolor art. So that's how you're able to get some varying line widths with this brush. I will say one of the things you ought to practice as well is trying to use this brush to get very evenly with lines, and even doing so with some curvature is going to really be a good practice. And so an example of that would be holding the brush vertically and making your line shape, but keeping the brush vertical to the line that you're making the entire time, so that you're trying to get as even with the line as possible, even though the line is curving around and moving. That's another way you can use this brush. Now, it's another really kind of surprising way to use a flat brush would be some type of a compound stroke that we can use for leaves. And you're thinking, well, how are we going to do that leaf shape with this flat brush? Well, let's go ahead and make ourselves a little stem here. You'll see if we start here, we just use our pressure stroke and we lift, we're going to get that similar type of leaf shape, right? So just like a pressure stroke, we're just changing the angle of our brush as we do that. So here are several different ways to utilize your wash brush to make different marks on your paper. So many different brush strokes. Same thing here with our round brushes. Try this out with different size brushes. Give yourself some room in your sketchbooks or whatnot to practice. This is going to be, you see I've done this many times. This is something that you can do, daily in your watercolor journal, or you can do as a warm-up before you start in on a painting. But this is really just a fun, easy way to get to know, again, your paints, get to know the ratio of water to paint. Remember, unless you add water and get it nice and activated, you don't really have watercolor paint yet. You still just kind of have water and paint. And we want to make sure that we're getting the right consistency as well as the right saturation, depending on how light or dark we want our color. We're going to talk a little bit more, or maybe even a lot more, about water control in the next video, where we take everything we've learned so far and put that together to create an abstract watercolor piece that you're going to find really easy to create, but also really beautiful to look at and something you're going to want to hang right in your home. So don't forget to check out that next video. And if you don't hit subscribe now, you might miss out on that being published. But also check out the Watercolor For Real Beginners series. We've got lots of videos out there already. And so we'd love to have you paint along with us and learn everything about watercolor. Lastly, we do have the Watercolor For Real Beginners Facebook group. If you're not a member, we really encourage you to check that out. There's a lot of supportive people in the group, as well as tons of other beginners just like you, and we're ready to help support each other through our watercolor journey. So thank you for watching. Stay tuned and happy painting.